What would you do if your entire family saw you as the charity case? If every smile was laced with pity and every compliment masked a jab? My name is Eliza Bennett. I'm 32, and last Friday I walked into my grandmother's Boston mansion, once my safe haven, feeling like an intruder at my own family's altar. The annual Bennett Legacy Conference, a tradition that used to mean something. Back when Grandma Elizabeth was alive, it was about values, purpose, quiet strength. Now it's a glorified status pageant. I parked my dusty old Toyota between my cousin Blake's matte black Range Rover and Victoria's newest BMW. The valet didn't even offer to park mine. He just stared like I'd taken a wrong turn. Walking up the white limestone steps, I passed a fleet of designer heels, patent leather loafers, and Gucci sunglasses. I glanced down at my Banana Republic blazer, modest, wrinkle-free, but painfully out of place. You could practically hear the whispers trail me as I stepped into the grand foyer. "There she is," murmured someone. Still dressing like it's 2012. They didn't see what I carried in my briefcase, or what I'd built while they vacationed in St. Bart's and posted about hustling. 10 years. 10 years of their sideways glances and faux sympathy. They thought I was scraping by while they played Monopoly with real buildings. They didn't know I'd been playing my own game, quietly, strategically, patiently, and it started the night everything shattered. When I was 15, both my parents, my father an architect and my mother a kindergarten teacher, were killed in a car crash on their way back from a weekend trip. That was the night my childhood ended. I moved into this mansion under the care of Grandma Elizabeth, while the rest of the family whispered behind wine glasses about how I'd become their collective burden. Poor Eliza Aunt Catherine said once, not knowing I was within earshot, "She'll never quite belong, you know." They were right. I didn't belong in their world of flashy privilege, empty status, and shallow metrics of success. But Grandma, she saw something else. On quiet nights, I'd find her in her study with a glass of sherry and her old investment ledgers. She'd call me over, and we'd pore over stock charts and real estate listings. Eliza, she'd whisper, "True wealth is never loud. It's what lets you sleep at night. It's power without a megaphone. It's impact without applause." I listened. I learned. And when she passed away during my senior year of college, I took every lesson she gave me and ran with it. While my cousins used their inheritances to buy beach condos, Porsches, and even a yacht, Blake named his liquidity. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment with thrifted furniture and invested every dollar I had into overlooked properties in neighborhoods no one paid attention to. I didn't post about it. I didn't flaunt it. I just kept going. By my 28th birthday, I owned 12 residential properties and 3 commercial buildings, all through anonymous LLCs set up by Mr. Winter's grandma's old lawyer. So as I stood in that familiar marble foyer last Friday, listening to the clinking of designer bracelets and the hollow laughter of people who still saw me as a failure, I reminded myself they don't know who they're talking to. Martha, the housekeeper, who had been with our family for over 30 years, was the first real face I saw. She greeted me with a cinnamon-scented hug and tears in her eyes. "You look more like your grandmother every year," she whispered. "She'd be so proud of you." My throat tightened. "Thanks, Martha. I'm here early to visit the rose garden." She leaned in, lowering her voice. "Be careful. Mr. Richard's been here since this morning. Shuffling things, talking to lawyers. Of course he was. Uncle Richard had taken over after Grandma's passing and twisted everything into a grotesque performance of wealth. He turned what used to be a gathering of shared purpose into a Hunger Games for attention. Now he wanted to sell the mansion our family's heart and replace it with condos, the same mansion where Grandma taught me everything. As I climbed the staircase to my old room, the only one in the house left untouched, I passed portraits of past Bennetts in gilded frames, all of them men, all of them staring down like gatekeepers of a legacy I was never invited to inherit. I stepped into my childhood sanctuary, pale blue walls, white bookshelves, my old finance journals tucked beside classic novels. I ran my fingers across the spines, letting the memories crash in. And then I found it Grandma's notebook with her neat, slanted handwriting. Security, opportunity, impact, it read in faded ink, the real metrics of wealth. Before I could even breathe in the comfort, a soft knock came. Jessica. The only cousin who ever saw me without a lens of judgment, a pediatrician, kind-hearted sharp. She looked around my room and sighed. He's proposing the mansion sale. Full redevelopment. Votes are already lined up. I swallowed hard. He can't. He can. He's bringing in developers tomorrow. This isn't a discussion, Eliza. It's an ambush. The only votes that mattered in this family came from ownership, not legacy, not emotion. I'm going to fight this, I said, fists clenched. Jessica nodded. Good. You're the only one who can. She paused at the door. Oh, and Victoria's already asked twice if the poor cousin arrived yet. I laughed, cold and sharp. Wouldn't want to disappoint her. As the sun set outside and the chandelier flickered above the grand dining room, I knew the next few days would test me more than any spreadsheet or property deal ever had. But I also knew one thing with certainty. They'd forgotten who taught me how to play this game. And they were about to find out just how well I'd learned. The dining room glowed with candlelight and champagne flutes, but every word spoken around that table felt razor sharp. I sat near the end as usual, far from Uncle Richard's power corner, but close enough to hear the hierarchy in action. Richard held court at the head, swirling his 30-year-old scotch and smiling with the self-satisfaction of a man convinced of his own brilliance. Our latest condo project in Beacon Hill sold out pre-construction. He boomed. We had to turn away buyers. The demand for high-end vertical luxury is just relentless. Cousin Brad leaned forward. Speaking of luxury, that Maserati out front. Only 9-month wait list, but they expedited it for the Bennett name, of course. He looked at me smug. What about you, Eliza, still rocking that vintage Toyota? I smiled, sipping water. Still runs like a dream. Aunt Catherine, draped in pearls that cost more than most people's mortgages, leaned in with a pitying frown. Dear, if you ever want help upgrading your lifestyle, Richard could mentor you in some property investments. I wanted to laugh or scream. Instead, I just nodded. That's very kind. Their digs were subtle, coated in courtesy, but sharp as glass. Comments about vacation homes, jokes about designer handbags. Dinner became a parade of strategic flexing, and I sat through it like I always had. Calm, measured, waiting. But when dessert was served and the candlelight flickered off the gold trim of the room, I excused myself. I needed air. Outside in the rose garden Grandma had tended with her bare hands, I walked between rows of scarlet and blush blooms, the scent like memory itself. I stopped by the bench where she used to read to me. I could almost hear her voice. They confuse noise for power. Eliza. Never forget the quiet ones build the strongest foundations. That night, I made a decision. I wouldn't just resist the mansion sale, I would stop it. Morning sunlight painted golden streaks across the carpet as I sat in the drawing room, once a place of family unity. Now it looked like a corporate showroom. Gone were the ancestral portraits. In their place, renderings, tall glassy towers, abstract angles, cold steel, the proposed future. Richard stood at the front beside a projector. Several unfamiliar men sat quietly at the back, developers, no doubt. The air reeked of money and arrogance. Glad you could join us, Eliza, Richard said as I slipped into the seat next to Jessica. We're beginning our discussion on image and standards. He launched into a speech about brand reputation, growth opportunities, and strategic repositioning, all euphemisms for what it really was, erasure. When the slide showing the mansion appeared on screen, my breath caught. This property, Richard said, gesturing with flair, holds sentimental value, yes, but it sits on 5 acres of prime real estate. Estimated value $45 million. We owe it to ourselves to unlock that potential. Aunt Victoria raised her hand, all manicured grace. Before we move forward, let's be sensitive. Eliza. I know you lived here during a difficult time, but surely you understand this is a sound financial move. Her words were dipped in honey but aimed like daggers. Before I could respond, Blake piped up. Speaking of smart decisions, did anyone notice my new SL Roadster Outfront Limited Edition? Only 20 in the country. It was a carefully planted distraction, one meant to remind everyone that Blake belonged in this room, that I didn't. Richard nodded approvingly. That my boy is exactly the kind of image that reinforces the Bennett brand. He advanced the presentation discussing projected ROI from the condo conversion. Brochures were handed out, shiny booklets showing modern architecture that had no soul, no history, no trace of the woman who once walked these halls with a garden trowel in one hand and a financial report in the other. I raised my hand. Eliza, Richard said, trying and failing to conceal his impatience. I think we should consider what Grandma would have wanted, I said steadily. She saw this home as our anchor, not a financial asset to flip. She wanted it preserved, to serve as our gathering place, a legacy. Richard's smile tightened. Elizabeth had many admirable ideas, but the market has changed. We have to adapt, Aunt Catherine added with a little titter. And with your limited experience in high-value real estate, dear, this may be beyond your expertise. I didn't blink. Actually, I've analyzed the surrounding property trends. This area's value increases when its historical integrity is preserved. A condo development here would dilute the long-term appeal. The room fell quiet. Brad chuckled. And what would you know about real estate, Eliza? You're still renting that little apartment, right? My hands clenched beneath the table. Yes, that's by design. Shuri smirked. Just like choosing a $150,000 car is my choice. Some of us can afford our lifestyles. Others pretend their limitations are preferences. Laughter followed, soft, cruel. Richard cleared his throat. Let's proceed to a preliminary vote on whether to pursue the sale. Specific offers can be discussed afterward. The results were immediate and predictable, overwhelmingly in favor of selling. Only Jessica and I voted no. As we broke for lunch, I stepped outside my breath, catching in the cool air. They didn't just want to sell the mansion. They wanted to erase everything it stood for, everything Grandma taught me, and I was the only one who could stop them. Sunday morning came cloaked in the kind of tension that sits under your skin. This was the heart of the conference the day every Bennett strutted their financial feathers. Net worth updates, asset disclosures, subtle power shifts dressed up as presentations. I dressed with care. Simple blue blouse, black slacks. My mother's pearl earrings. The same ones she wore to parent-teacher nights and open houses. The kind that said substance before flash. The drawing room had been transformed again. Yesterday's cozy circle of chairs, replaced by a long mahogany table set with tablets and leather portfolios, the family crest embossed in gold. My folder, noticeably thinner than the others, waited at my seat like a loaded question. Richard, ever the conductor, began with rehearsed gravitas. We'll begin today by reviewing individual holdings and updating the voting structure in line with contribution. As he spoke, his assistant passed out updated spreadsheets. Each family member's share of the Bennett fortune, calculated down to 2 decimal places. I scanned mine 2%. Based on the modest inheritance Grandma left me and the vague salary I'd declared as a financial consultant, I knew what it meant, that to them I was still an outlier, still the poor cousin watching from the sidelines. Brad was first to present. He launched into a slideshow about his new Aspen property. 4 bedrooms, ski-in, sky-out access hot tub with a mountain view. He bragged like he was auditioning for a reality show. Blake followed, gloating over his tech startup returns and recent yacht upgrade. Victoria walked us through her private art acquisitions and how her kids had gotten into a private school with a 5-year wait list. They made an exception for the Bennett name, of course. Each cousin, each aunt and uncle took turns sharing tales of their wealth accumulation. Applause, follow-up questions, admiring nods. It was a synchronized dance of ego and inheritance. Then it was my turn. The energy shifted. Phones appeared in hands. Whispers flickered like static. Richard barely looked up from his notes. I kept my voice calm, polished. I gave them what they expected, a bland summary of consulting work, some mild gains, a modest portfolio of safe investments. Aunt Catherine cut in first. Have you considered a career change, dear? Surely you could do something more substantial with the Bennett name behind you. Before I could answer, Brad added, or marry well. That's still a valid strategy, right? Laughter rippled through the room. I held my gaze steady. I'm quite satisfied with my current path. Richard leaned back in his chair. On that note, let's revisit the proposal I mentioned yesterday, creating a formal support structure for family members who may be financially less fortunate. Everyone knew who he meant. They weren't just dismissing me. They were offering me a stipend, like a charity case, like I hadn't spent a decade outmaneuvering all of them in silence. I said nothing, but my mind screamed, they have no idea who they're laughing at. That night, I locked myself in my childhood room and called Mr. Winters. They're planning to amend the will's safeguards, and they're talking about pressuring the mystery owner of Victoria's apartment building into selling. He chuckled. I thought this might happen. Your ownership structure is ironclad, anonymous, bulletproof. I'm done hiding, I said quietly. Can you have all my documents couriered here? Ownership records, valuations, trust formation, everything. There was a pause. You're sure I'm sure? Because tomorrow during the final financial presentations, I wouldn't just share numbers. I'd drop the truth like a thunderclap. The next morning, the air felt sharper, as if the mansion itself sensed what was coming. I arrived early, set my leather portfolio down at the table with care. The same kind my cousins flaunted every year, except mine carried more than pretense. It carried power. When the rest of the family filed in, Richard opened the day's agenda with his usual pomp. We'll finalize the mansion sale paperwork, then shift to the apartment complex acquisition strategy. Faint murmurs of excitement passed around the table. They'd done the math. Richard stood to gain nearly $18 million from the mansion sale, my 2% a drop in their ocean. Before we proceed, I said, rising slowly, I'd like to present an update of my own. Richard frowned. We're on a tight schedule, Eliza. The developers need contracts signed by noon. This won't take long. I walked to the front of the room and opened my portfolio, pulled out one page, my net worth summary. For years, I began. I've listened to assumptions about my financial situation. I've been dismissed, mocked, laughed at. Today I'd like to correct the record. I handed the document to his assistant. Please project this. The screen blinked once, then displayed the number $73,200 Susan dollars. A silence fell so deep I could hear the air conditioning click. That's not possible, Brad blurted. I smiled. It is. And it's conservative. I began passing out documents, ownership titles, portfolio breakdowns, commercial property valuations. Expressions changed one by one. Confusion, shock, and in Brad's case, outright panic. Victoria stared at the page in front of her. You own Horizon Holdings. I nodded. Which owns Summit Investments, which owns the luxury apartment complex several of you live in. The room exploded in overlapping reactions. Blake knocked over his glass. Brad began muttering denials. Richard went pale. You can't possibly have acquired that building, he barked. The purchase price alone, $28 million paid in full, quietly, through entities you never bothered to investigate because you were too busy mocking my car. I walked around the table and stopped in front of Victoria. When you complained about the guest registration policy last week, you were complaining to me. Blake looked stunned. The security upgrades approved after a break-in 2 floors below you. Brad scoffed. So what? That doesn't change the voting structure? I nodded. True, which is why I made a few changes. I placed one final document in front of Richard, the formation papers of Elizabeth's Legacy Trust. This morning, all my holdings were transferred to this trust, which also finalized the acquisition of Jenkins Development, the entity that through proxy purchases owns 30% of Bennett family holdings. Richard's hand shook as he flipped pages. Combined with my 5% inheritance stake, I now control 35% of the vote, enough to block any sale. Silence. Then Jessica began to clap, slow, measured, and proud. Grandma would be so proud of you. Chaos. That's the only word for it. After I dropped the bombshell about my net worth and controlling interest in the family holdings, the drawing room morphed into something between a courtroom and a reality show meltdown. Brad stood up first, waving the papers in the air like they might dissolve under scrutiny. "This is insane," he shouted. "You manipulated the system. You hid behind LLCs and trusts. Who does that?" I didn't flinch. Anyone with foresight and patience. Uncle Richard stayed seated, fingers tented beneath his chin eyes, calculating. The realization was sinking in. He'd been outplayed by the orphan he'd once suggested needed a family stipend. Blake paced near the fireplace, muttering to himself. Victoria stared at the deed to her apartment building as though it were written in another language. "Wait," she finally said. "You raised our rent?" I nodded. Slightly. "Still under market value. You're welcome." Jessica stifled a laugh. It was surreal watching them stumble to recalibrate everything they thought they knew. Brad, still red-faced, pointed at me like a prosecutor. "You've been pretending to struggle, living like a peasant while the rest of us actually built wealth." "No, Brad," I said, voice firm. "I've been building wealth. You've been spending it." The words hung there, sharp, true, and unarguable. Then Richard finally spoke. "Well, perhaps this opens a door to a more collaborative family approach. Translation. You won, but let's pretend we're equals now so I can still benefit." I tilted my head. "A collaboration based on Grandma's principles or your own." He smiled thinly. "We could revisit the definition of legacy." I offered nothing back. He'd adjust, but not out of respect, out of necessity. Aunt Catherine, ever the strategist, changed tack completely. She rose and approached me, the faux sympathy turned up to 11. "Eliza, dear, why didn't you say anything sooner? We could have helped you grow." I raised an eyebrow. "You offered me a mentor and a stipend." Her mouth twitched. "Yes, well, that was before we knew I wasn't your project." Silence. Again. They were reeling not from my wealth, but from what it meant. They dismissed me. Pity laughed, belittled. Now they were tenants on property I owned and stakeholders in an empire they hadn't even seen coming. "I have no intention of evicting anyone," I clarified, "but I will be reviewing the rental discounts. They're disproportionate." Victoria looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. Brad threw up his hands. "You can't just do this, I already did." Uncle Richard straightened. "Fine. But this doesn't change the mansion vote. We signed contracts." I slid another folder down the table. Actually, the contracts weren't finalized because the ownership structure changed this morning, and the new trust, Elizabeth's Legacy Trust, will not approve the sale. A pause. Then I added, "Instead, we're converting the mansion into the headquarters of the Elizabeth Bennett Foundation." You could have heard a pin drop on the Persian rug. Jessica's eyes lit up. What kind of foundation one focused on affordable housing initiatives and financial education, especially for communities like the one my mother came from? Catherine blinked. That's noble. But what will the ROI be? Exactly what Grandma would have wanted. Impact, not just income. I saw Richard realize he'd lost not just control, but narrative. Still, he recovered quickly. Then perhaps we should all contribute, as a gesture of family unity. He sounded sincere, almost, but I saw the flicker in his eyes. This was survival mode, and I didn't need it. "I'm happy for anyone to join provided you align with the Foundation's mission. That means transparency, ethical reinvestment, and humility," Brad scoffed. "So basically everything we don't do," I smiled. "Exactly." The days after the revelation were odd. Suddenly I was invited to everything: private lunches, business calls, family roundtables. Everyone had advice, proposals, visions. Jessica and I sat on a rooftop cafe the following week, sipping coffee and watching the Boston skyline shimmer under afternoon sun. "It's like watching a wildlife documentary," she said with a grin. "Observe the alpha lions as they adjust to a new predator in the pride." I laughed. She wasn't wrong. Uncle Richard invited me to his exclusive club, a place where I was once politely excluded. Over wine and oysters, he leaned forward. We should merge forces, a legacy trust with a commercial edge. Would it still be called Bennett Holdings? I asked. Of course. Branding matters. I sipped my drink. Grandma thought values mattered more. He smiled. And look how far those values got you. Imagine what we could do together. Tempting, but empty, because I didn't want their power. I wanted to fix what they broke. Then came the emails. Aunt Catherine sent a guest list for her upcoming charity gala, suddenly featuring me as a keynote donor. Brad texted me an investment opportunity that looked suspiciously like a bailout. Blake asked if I'd be willing to sponsor his latest startup pivot. Even Victoria, barely able to hide her gritted teeth, offered to curate art for the Mansion Foundation. I declined them all, gently, professionally, because real power doesn't gloat. It selects. It builds. Back at the mansion, I oversaw the transition into foundation headquarters. Grandma's study was restored to its original glory, her rose garden protected under a conservation clause, and I drove there each morning in the same Toyota I'd had since college. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. They'd finally seen me. But more importantly, I finally saw myself. They say once people see your value, everything changes. But what they don't tell you is sometimes that recognition comes too late to matter. Or maybe it comes exactly when it's supposed to. The week after the family conference, the mansion felt different, lighter, like it had finally exhaled after years of holding its breath. No longer a trophy waiting to be sold, it now buzzed with plans, blueprints for financial literacy programs, community events, and affordable housing outreach. The Elizabeth Bennett Foundation had been officially announced. The name itself carried weight, but not the kind flaunted at galas. It was the quiet kind. Purposeful, lasting. And for the first time, my family began to shift. Jessica, ever loyal, stayed by my side, not out of obligation, but because she genuinely believed in the work. "It's like you pulled the curtain back," she said over coffee one morning, seated beside me in what used to be Grandma's reading nook. Now they have to see what they've ignored for so long. I nodded. I'm still not sure whether they see me or just the influence they missed out on. Jessica smiled. Maybe both. But that doesn't change who you are. She was right. For the first time in my life, I wasn't bending to fit their mold. I had outgrown it, quietly, without apology. Uncle Richard, true to form, adjusted quickly. He began including me in business briefings, copying me on internal family emails he used to keep tightly controlled. He even hosted a luncheon in my honor at his country club, a place I'd once been excluded from. "We underestimated you," he said, clinking his glass in a room full of high-backed chairs and shallow compliments. I just nodded. I knew what this was. Strategic repositioning. What he didn't realize was I wasn't repositioning with them. I was moving past them. Aunt Catherine attempted a softer campaign. She stopped calling me dear in that syrupy tone and started asking genuine questions about the foundation's mission. At a fundraiser she hosted, I overheard her say to a guest, "Eliza's doing incredible work." So grounded in ethics and long-term thinking. It would have meant more if I hadn't heard her mock me for driving a peasant car just months earlier. Still, I accepted the olive branches, but only the ones not laced with conditions. Some relationships healed, slowly. Some didn't. Brad, for example, couldn't quite process the new dynamic. He called once with an investment pitch. His tone was friendly, but it dripped with desperation. "You've got the resources now," he said. "Imagine what we could build together." I paused. I think we've already built very different things." He didn't call again. Victoria sent a handwritten note. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity won. "Eliza, I misjudged you. Badly. You had every right to humiliate us, and you didn't. I see that now. I don't expect forgiveness, but I do hope you'll accept my respect. Victoria." It wasn't a friendship offer. It wasn't a guilt-ridden apology. It was something rarer, recognition. But the moment that cracked me open didn't come from a cousin or an uncle or a strategic email. It came from Martha, our housekeeper of over 30 years. She found me in the rose garden one afternoon, clipping back a few overgrown stems that curled toward the path. "I brought you some iced tea," she said, handing me the same glass pitcher she used when I was 15. I sat on the bench beside her, the same one where Grandma and I used to sit under the magnolia tree. Martha looked at me for a long time, her eyes soft but serious. "You know your grandmother visits me sometimes." I turned to her startled. "In dreams?" She nodded. "Not often. But when she does, she says the same thing Eliza understood." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "She always knew you would do something important." Martha continued reaching over to gently pat my hand, but more than that, she knew you'd do it with your own 2 hands. Tears stung at the edges of my vision. This wasn't a boardroom revelation. It wasn't a flashy PowerPoint or a financial coup. It was real. It was the voice I'd been carrying for years reflected back to me in the one person who had seen it the whole time. She said you didn't inherit the name Martha, whispered you inherited the spirit. That night, I walked through the halls of the mansion alone. The creak of the floors, the warm glow of sconces. I ran my fingers along the door frames, remembering who had once walked them. Not just Grandma, not just my parents, me. And in that quiet, I realized I wasn't holding on to the past anymore. I was preserving the parts that still mattered and rewriting the rest. Because this wasn't just about financial vindication, it was about freedom. The freedom to define success on my terms, to say no to manipulation disguised as mentorship, to say yes to values over volume, roots over reach, to build a legacy that wasn't loud, but lasting. Today, the mansion hosts weekly workshops for single mothers, learning how to build credit and buy their first homes. The study hosts mentorship circles for young women interested in real estate and entrepreneurship, and the Rose Garden. It's now open to the public 2 Saturdays a month in memory of a woman who believed in beauty without spectacle. Sometimes I walk by a group touring the grounds and hear a guide say, "This used to be a private estate. Now it's the heart of a foundation that's changing lives." And I smile. Because I know Grandma would have stood at that same window, arms crossed and satisfied, and said, "Well done." It's been 6 months since that final day in the mansion. 6 months since I stood in front of my family and told the truth, not just about my net worth, but about the values I'd built it on. And the truth is, wealth didn't change me, but it revealed them. They had spent years defining success as flash status and dominance. I spent years building security, leverage, and quiet purpose. Now as I walk through the east corridor of the Elizabeth Bennett Foundation, formerly the family dining wing, I'm struck by the poetry of it all. The long, polished table once reserved for power plays and veiled insults now holds flyers for financial literacy programs, budgeting guides, and mentorship rosters. Children laugh in the converted sunroom where Grandma used to host garden teas. Now it's a reading nook for community teens. The walls are still paneled in oak, but the energy completely different, authentic, welcoming, free. And still, I drive the same Toyota. Not because I need to, but because I choose to. Because nothing says freedom louder than not needing to prove anything anymore. Even now, some cousins still don't understand. At a recent fundraiser, Blake cornered me with a smirk. "You could at least get a Tesla," he said, half joking. "You're a millionaire, not a monk." I smiled. "And yet, I made it here before your Uber showed up." He laughed uncomfortable, still unsure whether I was mocking him, but I wasn't. I'd simply stopped living in their frame of reference. There are still moments that sting. Brad occasionally drops a condescending comment like a reflex he can't shake. Victoria, though more civil, still treats me with the stiff courtesy reserved for people you want something from but don't respect enough to admit it. But I've learned something they haven't. Closure doesn't come from their apologies. It comes from your decision to stop needing them. The most powerful moment came during our foundation's first official event, a scholarship ceremony for high school seniors entering business school. I stood at the podium in the mansion's restored drawing room, the same space where Uncle Richard once declared I didn't have enough experience to comment on real estate. Now it was filled with young dreamers, some of them the first in their families to go to college. I looked out at their faces, some nervous, some proud, all full of potential. And I told them what Grandma told me. True wealth is never loud. It's not just dollars in a bank account. It's safety. It's agency. It's the ability to walk into any room and know you can leave if it doesn't serve you. I paused, letting that settle. I was underestimated for most of my life, even by my own family. But it wasn't their belief I needed. It was mine. Thunderous applause followed. But what struck me most was a young girl in the front row who whispered to her friend, "She's just so calm, like she knows who she is." That was the real victory. Not the $73 million. Not the mansion. Not even the respect I now command in a family that once pitied me. It was finally becoming someone I could be proud of. Someone Grandma would be proud of. Sometimes I sit in her rose garden, now preserved in perpetuity under a conservation grant, and reflect on how far I've come. I think of my parents, the architect, and the kindergarten teacher who taught me that love wasn't about pedigree and that value didn't require validation. I think of Grandma Elizabeth, who handed me a mutual fund guide instead of a credit card and said, "Learn to make your money quiet and your legacy loud." And I think of all the people watching this video, maybe you who've been dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated by those closest to you. Maybe you're still building quietly. Maybe no one sees it yet. But that doesn't mean it's not real, because here's what I know now. You don't need to scream to be powerful. You don't need approval to be valid, and you don't need their seat at the table when you can build your own. The house they tried to sell now stands taller than ever, not as a monument to wealth, but as proof that legacy can be reclaimed by the ones they least expect. So let them laugh, let them dismiss, let them pity. Just keep building, because one day the same people who mocked your silence will have no choice but to listen. And now I ask you, have you ever been underestimated by your own family? Have you ever been told you couldn't only to realize you already were? If you're still on that path, building piece by piece, I see you. Drop your story in the comments. I read everyone. Hit that like button if you've ever had to fight twice as hard for what someone else got handed. And if this journey resonated with you, subscribe. Because I have more stories to tell, more legacies to protect, and more quiet victories to celebrate. Thank you for joining me. And remember, the most powerful move isn't proving them wrong. It's living so fully that they no longer matter.